So I'd first of all like to present my humble pranams to Swamiji at his lotus feet and to the previous Mathadipati as well. I did not have the good fortune of seeing him in person. I wanted to, but I couldn't. And I'm grateful to the Almighty for giving me an opportunity to see you in person and to also speak about a topic that is close to my heart in your presence. I'm grateful for everyone who's turned up here as well as the live audience. I have not come with a particularly prepared speech because fortunately, thanks to the book that I've written, I think there is what I would call some amount of masala which I'm in a position to deliver. So let me see what I do. One of the reasons that I chose this particular topic, and the topic is duties and rights in a civilizational society, as opposed to calling it rights and duties in a civilizational society, is in a civilizational society, duties come first. So let me try and explain my position in as clear a manner as possible without making it too technical. So from the topic itself, or from the title of the topic itself, let me see how many layers come out of it. So I've called it duties and rights in a civilizational society. So the premise is that the society is a civilizational society, first of all. And then in terms of the order of priority, I say duties and then rights. So in the context of Bharat, why do we call it a civilizational society? Why not a national society? What is the difference between a national society and a civilizational society? A civilizational society is typically defined perhaps on three parameters. One is the sheer scale of that society. Second is the diversity of that society. Followed by what connects that society as a single unit. Because unless and until there is some factor that unifies all these aspects, you might as well treat them as different societies. What is the point of treating different identities or seemingly different identities as one civilizational society? So, during the course of writing of this book, I came across the works of several authors and scholars of perhaps early 1900s who were trying to explain to the British that you can't treat us at par with any single country of Europe, but you must see us as a different Europe in itself. Or perhaps Europe is a smaller version of Bharat, simply because you cannot match our scale in terms of diversity or in terms of sheer number of languages. Because when our freedom fighters and independence movement leaders were trying to ask for a separate state for Bharat, the British man is basically telling us only a society that has a common identity can become an independent country. There is nothing common within the people of Bharat. Bengalis are separate, Tamilians are separate, Kannadigas are separate, Malayalis are separate. Therefore, you cannot claim a single identity. That was his excuse for not giving us the same status that he was willing to give to other societies. Forget the state of a complete independent state. He was not even willing to give us the dominion status. Because he said, even for dominion status, there must be some cultural similarity within yourself. And unless and until you establish that, there is no question of giving you even a dominion status. So around that period, a movement started with several leading thinkers from Bengal. Imagine, today we think of Bengal as having moved away from the civilizational, let's say, epicenter, but leaders from Bengal, thought leaders from Bengal, from the south, from the Madras presidency, they started producing works basically to establish three factors, or at least the first important factor that they wanted to demonstrate to the British man was the concept of a nation that you apply to Europe can simply not be applied to us. One, because we are a civilization, we are not a nation. Second, however you choose to define a nation or a civilization in the context of Europe, you can't apply the same mapdand or benchmarks to us, because our way of functioning as a civilization is different. Three, in terms of sheer antiquity, we are far older than you. So please don't make the mistake of trying to judge us on your relatively new standards. So they tried to establish this. So they came out with multiple works trying to establish why they satisfied the requirements of a political unit, but not as a nation, but as a civilization. So I've had the benefit of reading people like, or scholars like Sri Radhakumud Mukherjee, Jadunath Sarkar, R.C. Majumdar, Neelakanta Shastri, several people around that period who were producing fantastic literature, trying to talk about different aspects of this particular land, showing that we are all one. But what connects us? So they basically said that Bharat as a political entity or as a civilizational entity is unified by the triple matrix of nature, dharma, and patriotism all being connected. You cannot separate dharma from prakriti, and you cannot separate dharma from desha. That is effectively the position that they took, which is to say, after a point of time, once, let's say, the Bharata race or the Tritsu race or that particular tribe which established the central civilization after what we call the Battle of 10 Kings, the Dasaragnya, so to speak, they continued to move forward. And this is not the same as the Aryan invasion theory that we are taught, but they decided to assimilate and accommodate all these thoughts. And so the first notion of what is the Saptasindhu civilization was limited to the rivers of the top or the north. But as they progressed, gradually they started including the rivers of the south. So Godavari also became part of that particular expanded spiritual consciousness. So as the thought expanded, so did the physical presence, or rather the other way around. As the physical presence expanded, they accommodated all of this. Radhakumud Mukherjee shows this brilliantly in his book, that the initial hymns of the Rig Veda speak of a specific set of rivers which are traceable to what we know as the Punjab region today. But as time passes by, the rivers of the south, Kaveri, Godavari, start becoming part of this particular hymn, clearly showing that there is a different way in which we function. But most importantly, to avoid any regional feelings from taking, let's say, birth, which are superior to the national feeling or the civilizational feeling, we come out with a concept of tirtha. Pilgrimage effectively is our way of unifying this land. That all directions effectively are as sacred as one particular direction. There is no particular region in this country which is more sacred. So people of the north are expected to worship places in the south, and people in the south are expected to worship places of the north. So how they use pilgrimage as a way of creating a civilizational unity, coupled with the fact that pilgrimage is also used as a means of protecting nature. That those places which have a fragile ecological balance and which represent nature in all its beauty and purity are meant to be treated as Punya Kshetras. Therefore, there are rules of conduct which are to be observed when you go to each of these places. Now, assuming that this thought process was limited to one particular phase of Bharatiya history, then we can say, how can you use one phase to define the entire civilization? The best part is, every sampradaya subsequently adopts the same approach, which is, it does not limit the reach of any deity to one particular region. All the people of this land belong to the deity, and the deity belongs to the entire land. That seems to be the thought process. So in his works, he also explains how the Shaiva Sampradaya or the Vaishnava Sampradaya, how they operate on the same lines. Unfortunately, today we understand this history as a constantly warring history between the Shaivites and Vaishnavites, which may or may not have happened, because that is bound to happen with every different school of philosophy, which may want to prove that this is better, that is better. But there is a process of samanvaya that it goes through after a point where you try to assimilate, accommodate as much as possible. Otherwise, in this recorded history of so many thousands of years, You should have constant examples of Vaishnavites killing Shaivites and Shaivites killing Vaishnavites, which is actually an exception. If at all it has happened, it's an exception. So there is a principle of assimilation in a slightly different sense. European assimilation or Western assimilation believes in you converting to their way of life for you to be mainstreamed or accepted as part of the mainstream society. Whereas we are saying, you exist the way you want to, we exist the way we want to, without us crossing each other's paths. So this synthesis is uniquely a product of this civilization's own journey and experience, which they present as one of the defining features of the civilization, which the Western mind cannot understand under any circumstances, because purely on the basis of language, they've been fighting for several generations. And they've had race-based fights on, let's say, for several, at least let's say, ethnicity-based wars for several generations, despite having the same religion. And they fought on the basis of, let's say, denominational identities. I don't think similar examples can be shown from Bharatiya history. So, a triple matrix of nature, deification of the land itself as a deity, the personification of the land itself as a deity, which you are expected to treat as a punya bhumi. So what is the difference? For the Western mind, land is territory or property, whereas for the Bharatiya mind, land is punya bhumi, the place of your ancestors, first of all the Pitris, then your deities, and therefore your devatas and devi, so to speak. So the difference between European form of nationalism and Bharatiya form of dharmic civilizationalism is that Europe perhaps sees its territory as the property owned by a religion, whereas we see this land as an integral part of your religion and as a deity in the religion itself, which you are expected to worship. So when let's say in Bengal, when they started the freedom movement and they said that along with your worship of your deities, you should also start Rashtravandana, they were not doing something that was new. According to me, they were simply repackaging the original principles on the basis of which this civilization was founded. So they also come out with a fantastic distinction between what is the relationship between Jambudvipa, Bharatavarsha, Bharata, and they clearly say, as Jambudvipa, you're perhaps looking at a geographical consciousness, but as Bharatavarsha, you're looking at a civilizational cum political consciousness, which clearly identifies the geographies or the territory in which the Bharatiya civilization is to be found. So you cannot separate the civilization from its territory. They are connected to each other because one has given birth to the other. Now, the reason why this becomes important is, once you accept the premise that Bharata is a civilization, it means there are, for the sake of it, 108 sampradayas, let's assume for a moment, some 108 panths, okay? Now when you happen to have a society which has so many sampradayas, each sampradaya has its own group or has its own way of life, which it is trying to preserve and protect and advance. When doing so, it wants others to respect its space. Your primary duty is to respect the space of others also. So, in a civilizational society, the core group is not the individual, but the group. If you happen to be from a society which is of a common religion, a common sampradaya and common language, like Europe, then the core unit is an individual because everybody comes from the same group. But if you have multiple groups, then the core unit is not the individual, but the group. So the difference between a civilizational society and a national society is the degree of uniformity in a national society means that it can think of the individual as the basic unit. But in a civilizational society with multiple groups, every group is first of all trying to protect its own interests. And therefore the core unit happens to be the group and not the individual. In fact, the individual's identity cannot be separated from the group in a civilizational society. So I'll try to apply this in the terms of the language of the Constitution. So there are two provisions in the Constitution which are extremely important for religious rights. One is Article 25, the other is Article 26. Article 25 speaks of individual rights, individual religious freedom. Article 26 speaks of the rights of religious denomination. If you read the Hindi version of the Constitution, Anuchhed 26 becomes rights of dharmic sampradayas or sampradayas in general. So, although religious denomination and religious sampradaya are not strictly translations of each other because the concept is very different, unfortunately, since English happens to be the language in which the Constitution is understood, you have to resort to the use of religious denomination. But when we understand it, we should understand it as sampradaya. So, had we been, let's say, a society with a uniform identity, with very little diversity, you don't need Article 26. Because you're only looking at people from one sampradaya or one pantha. But because you have so many communities within one community or within one group, you need Article 26. So a lot of people assume that Article 26 was given to ensure that the rights of religious minorities are also protected. In fact, if you look at the language as well as the debates in the Constituent Assembly when this particular provision was being drafted, it is clear that this particular provision was first of all provided to preserve the diversity within the Hindu civilization. Because as much as you think of yourself as a Hindu, your first identity is that of your sampradaya. So whenever somebody asks me, do you think this is bad for unity, don't you think it's good for unity, and they keep bringing about this question, so I give them the example of how an army is structured. You have the company, then you have the regiment, then you have the larger entity. The human psychology being that it is easier for you to express your allegiance if the grouping is smaller. You know what you're protecting, you know what you're defending, you know what is it that you're supposed to follow, you have a set code of practices that you observe as part of that sampradaya, so it becomes easier for you to relate to it. When someone says Hindu unity, it is so vague, it is so amorphous. I'm not saying it is bad, I'm saying it is certainly important. But the first thing that you should call for is if everybody subscribes to their own, let's say, sampradayic identity and practices it, you are discharging your duty as a Hindu and not just as a member of that particular sampradaya. Because there can't be any two ways about the fact that your sampradaya is fundamentally within the dharmic fold. So as long as you discharge that particular duty, you have discharged your duty as a Hindu. Now, addressing the question of, let's say, how do we, so before I go to the second question, so let me first finish this segment, which is to say, therefore, in a civilizational society, since group rights are important, and they happen to be certainly more important than, let's say, the individual rights, when you speak of a civilizational society, the first concept has to be a duty and not a right. So this is something that I have tried to address in the book to some extent. The second thing why duty also becomes equally important is when you keep creating rights without a counterpart in the form of a duty, you are constantly signing away blank checks without money in the account. You're creating as many checks as possible without anything to back it up with. Or you're printing currency without gold bullion. That's how it works. What happens when you print money without, let's say, sufficient gold to back it up? The value of that particular currency falls. So today we have too many rights, but we don't respect anything. I don't think any right has any value today because there is nobody else who's interested in respecting the concept of a right, which is what translates to duty. Now, unfortunately, when you make this statement, typically the position that is taken from the other side is, are you saying that individuals have no rights? Are you saying that individuals have to constantly suffer and suffocate at the expense of the group? Are you taking us back to the Stone Age? How is this compatible with a modern society? How is this compatible with the concept of a democracy? There are enough cultures in the current, let's say, setup which respect the concept of a duty more than rights. We constantly look to the West. Why don't we look to the East? I'm sure that the Japanese understanding of rights and duties are very different from an American understanding of rights and duties. Why is that? Because they have continued to retain the cultural impact of, let's say, whatever they have been through as a society on the concept of rights and duties. In Bharat, the problem today is the state is actively running towards rights. Every arm of the state is pushing for rights. Islands like these mathas are asking for duties. So therefore, there is a constant tug of war between the state and the society. Because the society fundamentally believes in the concept of a duty, but the state is asking us to think of rights and rights alone. And the question that I think we should ask ourselves is, in such a huge society with a population which has always been this high, if you look at the history of the world generally, the two most populous regions always, typically, have been the Indian subcontinent and, let's say, the southern part of China. Simply because the river systems are great. And whatever you try and do, you will never be able to change the manner in which people live in Kashi, because it will always abound with people thanks to Ganga flowing there. You can try and at best make it a bit more systematic, but you can never reduce the population there, because that's the nature of that particular place. It's fertile and therefore people will constantly grow. So when there are so many people and the sheer scale of the society warrants a serious revisitation of whether you can respect only a rights-based approach, whether it is even feasible. When you have so many people, one of the things that you immediately look at is, what is the impact of the presence of such a huge human population on nature is one question that you will be forced to ask. Can you sustain the needs of everybody, the desires of everybody, and can nature sustain that if the approach is purely on the basis of rights? Unfortunately today, from basic needs being given the status of rights, even luxuries are being escalated to the status of rights gradually. Because what is a right is not a function of whether you actually need it. It is a function of how dependent you think you are on it. Let me try and make this slightly provocative. I can't help not being provocative. I'm sorry, that's my nature, I can't help it. Some people have now, let's say, escalated this discourse to the point of saying that even beef consumption is now a human right, because apparently that forms part of the right to eat. First of all, in this country that cannot be accepted. But secondly, such an expensive form of food, you're telling me, is a basic right. It should be treated as a luxury. So aspects of choices are now being couched in the form of rights, as opposed to asking whether this is truly necessary. So imagine this is the absurdity of the rights-based discourse, where individual greed is now being given the shape of a right at the expense of the community. Or, for a moment, let's leave the community aside, at the expense of nature. Because this particular community or this particular civilization keeps nature at the center of its discourse. You have deified your elements, you have deified nature. Therefore, you cannot take a decision on these aspects without considering the impact of any decision on nature. Now, one of the things that I've tried to address through the book, and I'm not trying to sell the book here, but I'm simply saying that there are aspects which I've tried to cover in this book which are relevant, is the reason why we have landed ourselves in this huge confusion is that as a country which has been colonized for 200 years, we have completely accepted not just the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure of the European, we have also accepted the soft infrastructure of the European. So apart from, let's say, the institutions that he has built, which is to say the body, we have also accepted the Atma that he left here. So in the book, when I say coloniality or colonial consciousness, My reference is to the fact that the European spirit continues to haunt this particular land even after the body has left. That as long as that Pretatma continues to haunt this land, I'm sorry to say there is no Vimukti for this land. So the idea in this particular book is to basically say, we must do 13 days and ask it to leave. To say it's time to start the process, because we have suffered that consequence for 70 years now. Interestingly, my analysis tells me that until 1947, when we were under the British man, so to speak, we were constantly fighting the Pretatma. We were giving it a fantastic resistance. In the book, I have given example of a correspondence by the collector of the Bellary district that he is sending to his superior, I think sometime in 1834, explaining what is the education curriculum in the Patashalas here. I don't know, if, perhaps I'll show it from the book later. What was being taught was Mahabharata, Kalidasa, Ramayana, Vyakarana. This is in 1834. Why is 1834 important? 1835, one gentleman introduces a new form of education in this country. He is popularly known as Macaulay. His full name is Thomas Babington Macaulay. So he introduces that. We could have stopped that particular education system in 1947, which we have not. Both language and that education system, we have continued with it. Every time we have a discussion on how to ask the Pretatma to leave, we have a political discussion. The political discussion is the state has to change, our Vyavastha has to change, our Pranali has to change. The first thing that needs to change more than anything else is the education policy. It starts only from education and nowhere else. Education and language are the two primary mechanisms through which that Pretatma was inserted into this particular society's consciousness. In the book, I have shown extracts from British parliamentary debates where they say that the root of the Hindu society is its ignorance, and the root of that ignorance is its Hindu identity. That is what they say openly. They are not beating around the bush, they are not mincing words. They are clearly saying this because the white Christian is talking to another white Christian. He is basically saying the problem with this country is not the people, but the religion of the people. So we have to lift them out of their darkness, and the only way to do that is by introducing them to two things: the English language and English education and European education. So when people come and ask me whenever I have these lectures or talks, they say, what can we do, what can we do? I say, given a choice, will you send your children to a Veda Patashala or to a Christian convent school? Your choices will determine the future of this culture. I've gone to the extent of even asking this question because some people presented this problem to me. Apparently, it is easier to find a bride for someone educated in California as opposed to someone who's educated in a Veda Patashala. That it has come to that point. So in California, when they asked me this question in one of the lectures saying, what do you think we should do for temples? What do you think we should do for temples? I said, will you be willing to give, let's say, your daughter in hand to someone who's a Vedadhyayi as opposed to someone who's sitting in California? Then we'll have this conversation. Until then, I don't see the point in this conversation. I really don't see the point in this conversation because you have anyway decided to use this country as a launch pad to go and sit there. What is the point of crying from there? Come and cry here. If you have to cry, cry here. Why should you cry from a distance? Makes no sense. So the point is, education, I think, is where the beginning is to be made. So this is one aspect that can be addressed in two different ways. One is if the state suddenly decides to open up its mind and says, okay, we'll change the education system, we'll do something about it. That's one way of going about it. But my limited experience tells me that's not going to happen in the near future. Then what is the option? The option is, we should ask ourselves, okay, a boy or a girl from community a boy or a girl from community B, a boy or a girl from community C are sent to the same convent school. A comes from our community, B and C come from other communities. How are they able to retain their identity better despite going to the same school? Why is it that our people come out deracinated? Clearly, that means the school alone is not the problem. 3 people from 3 different communities enter one institution, receive the same form of education. The impact of the education on each of these people is different. One comes out with no sense of identity, the other 2 come out relatively less impacted, relatively less influenced by their education system. How and why? Then clearly the problem again is not fully the education system. There are 2 further barriers or filters. One is the family, and the second are the institutions of the community, such as these institutions. Children who at least have a strong backing from the family, and the family is supported by such institutions, and they have continuing relations with such institutions, will be able to resist the influence of the school system. This is not a permanent solution. This is a band-aid, because you're dealing with cancer, unfortunately, but at this point, this is the best band-aid available to you. You need an invasive surgery at some stage, you'll need chemotherapy, but I'm saying that for now, what is it that you can do? So, yesterday at a signing event at Jayanagar, or was it Jayanagar? No, I think it was MG Road. 2 young boys came and spoke to me during the event asking me, in fact their problem was very different. Usually it's the parents asking, how do we ensure that our children are connected to Dharma? Here it was the worst possible question that could have been asked, how do we ensure that our parents are related to Dharma? 2 young boys are asking me this question, and I was flabbergasted. I said, can you please repeat the question? I think I got it wrong. Okay. Namaste. So when they asked me this question, I said, are you dealing only with the immediate family or the extended family? Their point was, no, we have a problem with the immediate family. The more we try to connect to our roots, we are being told, this is the way of the past, move on. I didn't have an answer to the question at all. Imagine the plight of those youngsters who want to connect to their roots, and the first barrier is not their friends or peer pressure, or let's say their school or their education system, but the family itself. So this is the advanced stage of this roga. And I don't know whether to be happy about the fact that the youngster wants to learn, or sad about the fact that the parents are standing in the way. I have no idea how to respond to that situation. I said, Swami, this is beyond my capability, you go to a guru. I have no idea. I don't know how to deal with the situation, because I can only pity you for the fact that you're surrounded in a situation where the most important support system that is supposed to push you in the direction of Dharma is holding you back from Dharma and is actively asking you, don't go in that direction. Then what do? Allow me to switch to my mother tongue for a moment in Tamil, which is Rogam Mottama Muttipoiduthu, which is to say it has reached the Charam Sima. The disease has literally reached its Charam Sima. This is what we are currently staring at. While communities B and C are actively producing committed people. I am not saying this in any adversarial sense. I am not saying this in any negative sense. They are doing what their religion is asking them to do. So whether that is good or bad is for them to decide. I won't get into that question at all. That is between them, their conscience, and who they believe in. I am not in a position to sit and judge on that. As long as it does not impact me, I will not talk about it. When it impacts me, I'll start talking about it. The point I'm trying to make is, it is easy to blame someone else for the situation which we have created for ourselves. So for a moment, we should only ask ourselves this simple question. Removing all external factors, from this entire equation, if you were to simply analyze the problem on its own, is it not possible that somewhere you will find yourself responsible for where we stand today? And to assume that the state has the answer to all the problems, I would say, is a defeatist attitude, because this is an un-Hindu attitude. One of the things that I have said in the book as part of 7 policy prescriptions of what a civilizational state or a Hindu or a dharmic civilizational state must look like, citing expert literature, is the duty of the Raja typically has been to create conditions which are conducive for self-sustaining autonomous societal institutions. Why is that important? Rajas will keep fighting, but the society and life must continue. That has been the traditional approach. That is the sole reason that all these sampradayas have continued despite 14 to 1500 years of massive and continuous invasions, that particular societal structure has kept you alive. Interestingly, in my limited analysis, this autonomous societal structure has gone through the worst phase after independence, where you have been systematically dismantled one after the other. Assuming that particular societal structure was intact and the state was in the same manner as it exists today, I suspect I wouldn't have had those 2 kids asking me this nasty question. Because at the very least, there would have been some kind of a support system or a safety net. So, if someone were to ask me what is the list of priority and how do we change the situation, I'd say my limited mind and buddhi tells me, you start by reviving the autonomous nature of the Hindu society as much as possible, where it is in a position to retain control over cultural aspects independent of the state. That means the state must be told, whether you help us or not, please don't stand in the way. That's all we need. We don't need your support. As a community, we can take care of ourselves. We have entrepreneurs, we have our gurujis, we have a strong following base, we have the resources needed. According to me, money is not the problem. Honestly, I don't think money is an issue. We just don't want you to create more impediments. Others are doing it enough. You please don't join the line. That's it. So, conducive situation would be for the state to support, but since that's an ideal situation, so to use an oft-used English phrase which never happens in England because it's constantly rainy, one fine sunny day, let's hope that the state decides to support us. Whenever that happens, if at all that happens, I will leave that to Niyati, but until then, allow us to function without interference, and we know how to take care of our people. From education to self-sufficiency in all other aspects, I think this community knows what it needs to do and how it needs to do. If you can organize festivals, if you can organize so many events on your own without state support, and the only thing that you expect from the state is protection, nothing beyond that, why can't we run our own educational institutions? I don't think it's difficult at all. So, I have tried to give very limited self-help suggestions in the book, hoping that if the state suddenly grows a Hindu conscience, I'll be grateful. But if that does not happen, I hope that the society finds the help that it needs within itself. The reason why I'm circling back to all of this is I could have taken this discussion entirely in the direction of which community has more rights under the constitution, which community has less rights under the constitution, what happens to educational institutions. I could have turned this into an entirely legal discussion. But I don't think that would have helped, because you're discussing those aspects which are not currently in your reach or within your reach. In my limited view, if you were to generate, or if you were to, let's say, turn this situation around currently through these self-help mechanisms, it is my belief that the society will have a much better bargaining position with the state to deliver the final goods. According to me, that is the beta level of preparation. The alpha level of preparation is consolidation of the existing position, freeing your institutions from state control, judicious use of your resources, both for keeping the traditional core alive and the societal core alive. And then we talk of the next step. I'll give a simple example. Perhaps it may be relatable. So think of the Dharmic society as a set of concentric circles. At the epicenter is Dharma in its purest form, being practiced by the Sampradayic and traditional institutions. They will always be limited in number compared to the rest of the society, because only few can and few are capable of, or at least few are chosen for it. I will underscore this with an important caveat. I am bound to be accused of some caste-based prejudice when I make this statement. I am not referring to any caste here. I am merely saying every sampradaya has its own practitioners. At the heart of this particular concentric circle are the core practitioners of Dharma. The next rung of the circle are the followers of this particular Dharma, who follow and who receive the wisdom given by the practitioners at the core. The outer ring, according to me, is populated by people like me who don't know much about Dharma, but who know how to deal with the system, who believe in Dharma, but who think that the system needs to be spoken to and engaged with, because the system is the one that's constantly trying to interfere with the core. And then, of course, is the outermost ring is the state. What we have done is that we have inverted this and we have put state at the heart of it. No, that's okay. The state can be at the heart of this concentric circle. Even then it can't be if it's a dharmic state, because even then Dharma is the primary thing. But the state could have been the first circle outside of Dharma if this was a dharmic civilizational state, if it adhered to principles of Dharma. Currently it does not. And since it does not, in this map it is at the outermost region. So if you can get circle number 1, circle number 2 and circle number 3 right, then the core is very strong. And since the core is very strong, the outermost circle will have to talk to you. It will then have not a political incentive, it will have a political disincentive if it does not talk to you. The state will have a disadvantage if it does not talk to you, provided you get your act right in circle 1, circle 2, circle 3. And circle 1, circle 2, circle 3 starts with your religious institutions, your charitable institutions, and your educational institutions, and the society. If this is a consolidated, let's say, close-knit weave, then this society can withstand any kind of change, because it is no more dependent on the state for its survival and protection. The state should not and cannot be your first option of resort, because no community can afford to do that, because the nature of a democratic setup is that the political setup is dependent on multiple factors, multiple considerations. And you cannot hope that all your considerations are equally important to the state, because the state and people in power will have multiple permutations and combinations working. So my suggestion is, let the society begin its journey. Automatically the state will begin its journey. If not today, maybe in 10 or 15 years. And I will cite an example in which I think several people have played a leading role. the judgment of the Supreme Court in Ram Janmabhoomi was not a consequence of a political movement, it was the consequence of a societal movement. It was the society that effectively decided that this is our place, it belongs to our deity, and we need to take it back. And they have been consistently fighting for it, not for 60, 70 years, but for close to 500 years, from 1528. That movement ultimately put pressure on the state. So if somebody thinks that ultimately the state delivered the goods, or that somebody gifted to us as part of some political initiative, no. The society was very clear that there will not be any negotiation on this particular issue under any circumstances. This is a non-negotiable. According to me, that is a crystal clear example of the society dictating terms to the state as opposed to the state dictating terms to the society. So you have a live example which is successful. Today, you don't have to wait for 500 years or 450 years because technology makes it possible for you to create a multiplier effect. It makes it possible for you to share information, to change opinions, to create opinions. I'm not saying create facts, I'm saying to create opinions. There's a distinction. We don't need to create facts. Facts typically speak in our favor. History typically speaks in our favor. Other side has to create facts. We don't need to. So therefore the point is, if we can treat this particular example as a workable model, because sometimes all these changes cannot happen overnight, they happen in an incremental fashion. Without dropping names, if the last 3 weeks of global developments are an example to go by, even a superpower can be defeated with 20 years of commitment, is the clear message to the world. What is important is commitment, clarity, and a certain degree of intransigence, which is to say, I will not change my position. This is where I will stand. If you have to move, you walk around me. I will not make way for you under any circumstances. That kind of commitment and clarity is the only thing that will save you today. And at this stage, where two youngsters are asking their parents permission to follow dharma, even now, if we don't wake up, then you deserve whatever is written in your destiny. That's all I can say. Then perhaps you deserve it because you don't value what you have. And therefore, for dharma to survive, it will have to be practiced by people outside this country, which is exactly what is happening today. So with this, I'm grateful for the opportunity. Thank you.